There was a time when I believed I had crafted a perfect life, not extravagant, not flawless, but full of quiet rhythms that made the days feel safe. A husband who kissed my forehead every morning, a little garden of herbs outside our kitchen window, a familiar cat who only purred when I came home. Even the creak in the hallway floorboards had become a part of the symphony of comfort I held dear. That illusion held together by routine and trust until the day it began to quietly fracture. I suppose the first crack was so small that I almost stepped over it, pretending it didn't exist. My younger sister Lena had just finalized her divorce after a difficult and humiliating year. I offered her the guest room in our house out of love, out of family duty, out of an instinct older than logic. I never once imagined that letting her into our home would be the same as letting a knife inch slowly toward my back. In those early days, I convinced myself it was normal. The way Daniel would pour Lena a glass of wine before me at dinner, the way they laughed a little too easily, exchanged glances that lingered just a second too long. I dismissed it all. She was hurting, he was being kind, and I was overthinking. But denial has a smell. It's faint like smoke from a fire that hasn't started yet, something you can't see but your lungs still recognize. There were nights I lay awake, listening to the creaking stairs, hearing muffled footsteps at odd hours. I told myself Daniel was just heading down to check the thermostat, or maybe he couldn't sleep. I had no reason to think otherwise, except I did. Deep down, something inside me already knew. I busied myself with work. My interior design firm had just signed 2 major projects, and I drowned my instincts in sketches and client emails. It was easier to focus on color palettes than on the growing sense that I no longer understood the geometry of my own home. Lena began borrowing my clothes without asking. She used my skincare. One day I found her wearing my perfume, the one Daniel had given me on our 5th anniversary. She laughed it off, said she didn't even realize it, but I noticed how Daniel smiled when she walked by wearing it. It's strange how betrayal doesn't announce itself with thunder. It arrives like dusk slowly, shadows inching their way into light. I remember the day I caught them sitting too close on the back patio. The angle of their bodies said everything their mouths didn't. I stood there behind the screen door watching for a full 30 seconds. Neither of them saw me. Lena touched his wrist while laughing. He didn't pull away. That evening I made roast chicken and tried to act normal. I watched them across the table, memorizing their gestures. I saw how he passed her the salad tongs with a softness that used to be reserved for me. I saw how she looked at him like he was her oxygen, and how he inhaled her gaze like it was fire. I wanted to scream, but instead I smiled. Because sometimes pretending is the only thing that keeps you from shattering. A week later, I found a receipt in the pocket of Daniel's blazer when I was doing the laundry. A hotel, 2 nights. The name of the hotel was a place I knew neither of us had ever stayed. I turned it over in my hand like it might vanish if I stared hard enough. Instead of confronting him, I slid it into the back of my journal and closed it. That night, I took 2 sleeping pills and fell into a dreamless pit where no one knew my name. The guilt of not speaking up was worse than any confirmation of the truth. I began questioning everything. Was it my fault? Had I been too focused on work, too distant? Was I aging too fast? Had I become invisible? They say you can't lose what's already gone, but I think that's a lie. You can lose the memory of who you were, piece by piece, when the people you trust the most rewrite your worth with their silence. Lena began spending more time out of the house. Daniel too. And oddly, the days became quieter, almost peaceful in their emptiness. I started finding solace in the mundane, folding laundry, watering the basil, scrubbing the grout in the bathroom tiles. I think I was trying to clean away the rot that had taken root in the foundation of our home. Then came the day I decided to test the reality I was so afraid to name. I left my phone recording in the study, not because I was searching for proof, but because I needed something concrete, something I couldn't explain away with empathy or fear. What I heard that evening gutted me. Their voices were soft, but not soft enough. I played the recording over and over again, each time hoping I had imagined it. But there they were. His voice, saying her name like a prayer, her laughter low and intimate, and one phrase from Daniel that broke the spell of every wedding vow we had ever whispered. She doesn't suspect a thing. I turned off the recording, my breath caught in my throat, and I sat there for a long time, staring at the floor, my ears ringing like sirens after a storm. I didn't cry. Not that night. Something colder settled inside me, not hatred, not anger, just clarity. a clean, surgical awareness that my life, as I knew it, was over. I packed a small suitcase the next morning. 3 outfits, my journal, my grandmother's necklace. I left before sunrise, no note, no goodbye, just a quiet exit from a life that had betrayed me in whispers. As I drove away from the house I had once called home, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The sun was just rising, casting a soft amber glow on the street. The same street where Daniel once waited with flowers after my miscarriage. The same street where Lena and I used to race our bikes as children. It all looked the same, but I was not. I was no longer the woman who believed that love was a guarantee. I was no longer the sister who would give her last breath for family. I was something else now, unshaped, unsteady, but awake. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of everything I was meant to become. The apartment I found was small and dim, wedged between a shuttered bookstore and a laundromat that always smelled like stale detergent. It wasn't home, not even close, but it was anonymous, and anonymity felt like freedom. I moved in with 3 changes of clothes and a suitcase full of silence. The walls were bare, the mattress was thin, and the windows coughed in the wind. But for the first time in weeks, I could breathe without wondering if someone's whisper was meant to wound me. There were days I did nothing but sit, just sit, on the floor, on the edge of the bed, on the windowsill where the paint was peeling in lazy flakes. I stared at nothing for hours, waiting for the rage to come, but it never did. What came instead was hollowness. The kind that echoes like a room cleared after a funeral. I wasn't angry, not yet, just vacant. A house with the lights turned off and the key left in the lock. I didn't tell anyone where I had gone. Not my mother, who had always suspected Lena of being reckless but never cruel. Not my colleagues, who sent polite emails when I missed 2 meetings in a row. I didn't even tell Olivia, the elderly neighbor who used to wave at me every Tuesday morning when I watered the lavender. I wanted to disappear, and for a while I did. Time moved strangely in that apartment. It bent around me like light underwater, distorted and slow. I ate cereal straight from the box. I showered only when the mildew on the curtain became too visible to ignore. I left the TV on for background noise, but never watched. The news talked about politics and climate disasters, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The world had cracked open, and all I could see was the betrayal that lived in the shadows of my own blood. Eventually, I opened my journal again. The one that held the hotel receipt, now creased and smudged from my thumb, pressing into it every night like a worry stone. I wrote not because I had something profound to say, but because I was afraid of forgetting who I had been. I scribbled fragments, half-memories, lists of things I missed. Basil in the morning sun, the sound of my old oven ticking before it heated up, Daniel humming when he shaved, Lena laughing when we shared childhood secrets under blankets. But every beautiful memory had grown thorns. There was no thought that didn't lead to pain, and still I wrote. One morning, as the first frost painted the corners of the windows, I looked at my reflection and didn't recognize her. Letter 1B0. The woman in the mirror had dark circles like bruises, hair that hung lifeless, and eyes too dry to weep. But underneath the exhaustion was a faint flicker, something like defiance. Not the kind that rages, the kind that survives. I decided to move, not from the apartment, but from that emotional limbo. I began walking, at first just around the block, then to the park where dogs sprinted after tennis balls and children screamed with muddy joy. I wore sunglasses even on cloudy days, afraid someone might see my face and remember who I used to be. No one did. That was both a relief and a heartbreak. I passed a bookstore one day and saw a flyer on the window, writing workshop, women finding voice after silence. I don't know what made me walk inside. Maybe it was the word voice. Maybe it was because I hadn't used mine in weeks except to ask for receipts and plastic bags. Whatever the reason, I signed up. The workshop was held in the back of the store on Tuesday nights. Folding chairs, weak coffee, a mix of women, some older, some younger, all broken in invisible ways. We didn't introduce ourselves with pain, but with presence. That alone was revolutionary. I didn't speak the first 2 sessions, just listened. Heard stories about infidelity, addiction, loss. One woman had buried her son, another was recovering from a cult. Their stories didn't make mine feel smaller, they made it feel human. By the 3rd session, I read something aloud. Just a paragraph about the creak in the hallway floorboards, how it used to comfort me and how silence had now taken its place like a ghost. The room didn't clap, they just nodded, as if to say, yes, we know that silence. That night, for the first time, I slept without pills. I started going to the library again, reading memoirs, books by women who had lost everything and rebuilt something better from the rubble. I borrowed notebooks and filled them. I didn't write for healing. I wrote to understand, to unravel the knots Lena and Daniel had left in me. I wrote to reclaim the language of my own story. Weeks passed, the ache began to shift, not disappear, just evolve, from sharp to dull, from screaming to whispering. Some days I still sat on the floor, but not for hours. I could eat a real meal. I could walk past couples without tasting bile. I even smiled once when a little boy in the park gave me a dandelion and called me a queen. Then came the call. I hadn't changed my number. Some form of masochism, maybe, or perhaps a hidden hope that someone would reach out, not to apologize, but to explain, to give meaning to the betrayal, to offer a reason that would help me stitch my life back together. It was Daniel. It was Lena. It was our family attorney letting me know Daniel had submitted papers to transfer part of our joint assets. He had assumed I'd just quietly fade away, and with me all legal ties. But I hadn't. I still existed. Quiet didn't mean invisible. I asked the attorney to pause everything. I needed time. He agreed, though he sounded surprised by my voice, firm, direct. Maybe he expected the broken version of me. I think even I expected that. I sat with the papers for hours, looking at the signatures. Daniel's signature hadn't changed. Still neat, still slanted, still arrogant. He had signed away my contributions like they were furniture to be divided. But I was not furniture. I was not the wallpaper of his life. I was a co-author of every chapter he had conveniently redacted. I didn't call him, I didn't scream. I started gathering documentation, financial records, emails, copies of invoices from the design firm I had helped build. I spoke to an advisor. I contacted my former assistant. I began preparing not for revenge, but for reclamation. And in that process, something inside me shifted again. The ache became energy. The silence became strategy. The women at the workshop began noticing. One of them, a retired professor named Grace, said I looked like someone who had remembered she still had teeth. I laughed, not just a breath, but a laugh that came from the chest. It felt strange. It felt good. I went home that night and opened a blank document. I titled it, The Anatomy of After. I didn't know what it would be. A book, a blog, a whisper to the wind. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I was no longer speaking to survive. I was speaking to be heard. The next morning, I went to the cafe I used to love. I ordered the same tea, sat by the window, watched people, and I realized they hadn't changed. The world hadn't bent to accommodate my heartbreak. It had kept spinning, so had I, just slower. As I sipped the tea, I pulled out a photograph from my wallet. One of the last pictures of me and Lena as children. We were on a beach, covered in sand, faces sticky with popsicle syrup. I stared at that image for a long time, then I folded it and slipped it back. Not everything broken can be mended, and not everything lost should be found. But something new was beginning. I didn't know its shape yet, but I could feel it rising from beneath the ashes of what I once called love. Some people speak of healing like it's a moment, a switch flipped, a sunrise that breaks the night in one glorious instant. But healing, I've found, is a slow erosion. It's not light returning all at once, but a slow widening of the cracks that once only held darkness. It's waking up and realizing you didn't cry last night. It's making your bed not for someone else to admire, but because you deserve neatness, even in solitude. The winter in that little apartment wore on. The radiator hissed more than it heated. Outside, snow built up in layers, untouched by anything but time and the wind. I took to sitting near the window with a blanket wrapped around me, notebook in hand, legs tucked up like a child unsure of her place. I wrote compulsively, not masterpieces, not even coherent thoughts. Some days it was just a list of things I had survived. Other days, a scrawl of anger like a howl I couldn't bring myself to release aloud. I reread old journal entries, the ones written before the rupture. They felt like letters from another life, a softer voice, full of expectation, blind in all the tender ways that love permits. There was once a line I wrote about Daniel. He makes me feel like breathing is something I do for both of us. How naive that sounds now. How dangerous it is to forget that your breath is yours alone. Slowly, I began touching the parts of myself I had neglected. I redecorated the apartment, even though it was temporary. I chose colors for myself, not for clients. Deep indigo, mustard yellow, a splash of burnt sienna on a thrifted armchair that didn't match anything and somehow made everything better. I framed a quote above my desk. She remembered who she was and the game changed. Every time I looked at it, I felt something stir inside me, something fierce and unfinished. I started cooking again. At first, just to fill the space with scent, rosemary potatoes, tomato soup from scratch, banana bread that was too dry, then too moist, then just right. I played jazz while stirring. I danced in the kitchen alone with flour on my elbows and tears on my cheeks, not sadness, not joy, something unnamed, something healing. The women at the writing group became more than faces in folding chairs. They became a circle, a tapestry of lives I wove myself into without asking permission. Grace, the professor, encouraged me to submit a piece to a local magazine. I did. It was accepted. A short essay about silence and how loud it becomes when trust breaks. They published it under my real name. I remember holding the print copy in trembling hands, seeing my words in ink. It was the first time I had felt real in months. Then one gray Tuesday, something happened that pulled me further from the shadow. I received a message. It was from an old classmate, someone I hadn't seen since college. His name was Lucas. He had read my essay, somehow stumbled upon it through mutual circles, said it moved him. That he remembered me as the girl who always wrote with her whole spine. I laughed at that line, my whole spine. He was right in a way. I had forgotten how to stand tall. Maybe I was learning again. We exchanged emails, not often, not intensely, but meaningfully. He was now a journalist, recently returned to the city after years abroad. He understood the quietness of grief, the disorientation of rebuilding. There was no flirtation, no expectation, just connection. And after everything, that was enough to light something warm behind my ribs. In early spring, I visited the building where I used to work. Not to enter, just to stand across the street and look. The glass walls reflected a version of me I no longer recognized. Inside. I imagined Daniel still sitting in his corner office, sipping espresso and pretending the world hadn't caught fire. I didn't hate him. I no longer needed to. Hate was a weight I could no longer afford to carry. I stood there for 10 minutes. Then I turned and walked away, not looking back. I felt taller, not in height, but in presence. A few days later, I met Grace for coffee. She handed me a card, an invitation to speak at a local women's conference. "You don't have to be ready," she said. "You just have to be willing." I took it home, left it on the table, stared at it for hours, and then, one breath at a time, I began writing what I might say. The day of the conference, I wore navy, my power color. I pinned my grandmother's brooch to my collar, a reminder that I came from women who had endured more than I could comprehend. The room was full of strangers, but as I walked to the podium, I didn't feel small. I felt solid, rooted. I told them about betrayal, about the slow disappearance of self when love becomes conditional. I told them about silence and what it taught me. I told them that losing everything isn't always the end. Sometimes, it's the start of the story you were meant to live. They stood when I finished, not all, not loudly, but enough to make my knees go soft and my throat tighten. Afterward, a woman approached me, mid-40s, elegant, trembling. She said, "I left last night, after 23 years. Then she cried, and I held her like a sister I had only just met. In that moment, I understood. My pain had become someone else's permission. My survival had rippled outward. That mattered more than any closure I'd never receive. That evening, I walked along the river. The wind was sharp, but I didn't flinch. The city lights shimmered on the water, broken and beautiful, just like me. Lucas messaged later, said he saw a clip of my talk online, said he hoped we could meet in person. I said yes. Not because I was healed, but because I was healing, and that was enough. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't need to. I only knew that I was no longer defined by who had betrayed me, but by who I had become in spite of it. And as I stood by the water, alone but not lonely, I whispered something to the wind. I am still here. And that in itself was a triumph. Spring had stretched itself across the city like a tentative promise. Pale sunlight broke through the skeletal remains of winter trees, warming sidewalks still wet with thaw. There was something both fragile and triumphant about the season, like a wound slowly scabbing over, not healed, but on its way. That was exactly how I felt, not whole but no longer hemorrhaging. By now I had learned to inhabit my own space again. My apartment, though modest, had grown into something more than shelter. It was mine, cluttered with books, plants that refused to die, and tiny tokens of the woman I was becoming. A watercolor I had painted on a whim. A candle that smelled like bergamot and thunder. My voice had returned, not loud, not demanding, but unmistakably mine. The writing group had turned into a ritual I cherished. Tuesday nights felt sacred. We shared pages, but also parts of ourselves we hadn't dared give words to before. I had stopped counting the time since I left Daniel. I no longer measured days in distance from the betrayal, but in moments reclaimed from its grip. Then one morning, I opened my inbox and found a name I hadn't seen in months. Lena. Her email subject line was empty. I stared at it for a long time, heart still but mind racing. I hesitated to click, unsure if I wanted to reopen that door, but curiosity or perhaps closure got the better of me. The message was short, apologetic, hollow. A string of vague sentiments that rang with the dull echo of shame, not remorse. She said she was no longer with Daniel, that it hadn't worked out, that she was in therapy, that she hoped I was doing okay. I closed the laptop without replying. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. I owed her nothing, not forgiveness, not friendship, not even acknowledgement. She had chosen her path. I had chosen mine. They no longer crossed. Not long after, I received a call from a mutual acquaintance, a former client of mine who still moved in the same social circles Daniel had. She mentioned, almost casually, that Daniel had been placed under investigation at his firm. Accusations of misconduct, questionable billing practices, a pattern of professional deceit that seemed, in retrospect, inevitable. I didn't gloat, I didn't grin. I felt something colder, a kind of distant pity not for him, but for the man he could have been. For the integrity he once wore like a tailored suit and had long since thrown away. I wondered if Lena had seen that side of him, or if he had saved it for the women he believed would never leave. The news rippled quietly. No headlines, just whispers in legal circles. He wasn't disbarred, not yet. But his reputation was eroding like sand under tide. And with it, so too went the narrative he had built, the polished facade of the man who had it all. One afternoon, while walking home through a stretch of old city blocks, I passed the courthouse. Not the one where Daniel practiced, but another older building with stone columns and a bronze statue out front. I stopped. Not because I had business there, but because I realized something. I was no longer afraid of institutions. I wasn't intimidated by rooms filled with men in suits. I had survived a betrayal that had once stolen my breath. What after that could possibly silence me again? That night I wrote for 6 straight hours. It wasn't an essay. It wasn't a journal entry. It was something more. A manifesto, a reckoning. I poured into it every ounce of grief, resilience, and clarity I had accumulated since the day I walked out of that house. When I finished, I didn't know what to do with it. So I sent it to the editor of the magazine that had published my first piece. She called me within 2 days, said it was powerful, said they wanted it. Said they wanted me, not just the story, but the woman who had lived it and shaped it into something meaningful. She asked if I would consider doing a live interview, a reading, a panel. My first instinct was to retreat, but then I remembered who I had become, and I said yes. The reading took place in a repurposed theater, once home to plays and piano recitals, now hosting authors and activists. I wore the same navy dress I had spoken in at the women's conference. I stood behind a lectern, palms damp but posture steady. The lights weren't blinding. They were warm. I read about silence, about how betrayal doesn't just steal trust, it steals language. I spoke about rebuilding, not just a life but an identity. I ended the piece with a line I had scrawled months earlier in a moment of anguish, now reshaped into resolve. He broke me, yes, but he did not keep the pieces. There was quiet when I finished, and then applause, full, honest, affirming. A sea of strangers who now carried a fragment of my truth with them. It felt like shedding a final layer of skin. After the event, a woman approached me, not young, not old. She introduced herself as a publisher. She had followed my work. She asked if I had ever considered turning my story into a book. I blinked, stunned, then nodded. Yes. I had considered it every night I sat alone, wondering if pain could ever be made useful. In the following weeks we met, discussed, drafted outlines. The story was mine, but the world wanted to read it, and I was ready. The title came easily, The Forgotten Woman, because that was what I had been. What so many women are, forgotten, dismissed, silenced, until they refused to stay quiet any longer. Lucas, my old college friend turned quiet companion, sent flowers on the day the deal was signed. A bouquet of yellow tulips and white hyacinths. A note that read, "This is only the beginning." He was right. We met for coffee again, this time without the awkwardness of strangers. He was kind, steady, curious but never intrusive. He listened in a way that made you feel like your thoughts were worth waiting for. We didn't speak about Daniel or Lena, not because it was forbidden, but because the past no longer demanded to be the centerpiece. Instead, we spoke of books, of cities we wanted to visit, of the kind of lives we still hoped to build. There was no urgency, no illusions, just two people no longer fractured, walking beside one another with the soft awareness that life still held space for joy. One evening, walking home from a literary event, I passed a bookstore and saw my name in the window. A pre-order display. My name bold, real, permanent. I stood there for a long time, staring through the glass. Behind me, people walked by without noticing. The city churned, horns blared, life moved. And I had moved with it. I thought of the girl who had once taken sleeping pills just to silence her own thoughts. I thought of the woman who had packed a suitcase in the dark, carrying nothing but grief and a grandmother's necklace. I thought of her, and then I smiled. Because she was still me, but now I was more. The irony of rebuilding your life is that the world assumes you've forgotten what broke you. They see the healed version, the polished surface, the woman who speaks on stages and signs books, and they think the pain no longer lives under your skin. But pain never leaves entirely. It just grows quieter, waits in the corners of memory like a shadow at dusk, ready to stretch long when you least expect it. It was a Thursday morning when I received the envelope. Not an email, not a text, but a proper manila envelope, the kind thick with purpose. It arrived at my door with no return address, just my name in careful block letters. I knew before I even opened it that something was about to shift. I felt it in my throat, in the space behind my ribs, in the way the air suddenly felt heavier. Inside were documents, legal filings, bank records, transaction histories, all stamped with the logo of Daniel's former firm. But it wasn't the content that stunned me. It was the letter attached, a whistleblower complaint, untraceable, anonymous, but the subtext was clear. Someone inside the firm wanted me to see this. As I read piece by piece, a quiet fury began to hum beneath my skin. This wasn't just misconduct, it was theft, falsified billings, asset redirection, fraud. And some of the accounts traced back to assets that had once been under my name, funds from our joint ventures, subtly siphoned before I ever left. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, he had betrayed me financially, legally, and with calculated precision. I could have chosen silence. I had a good life now, peace, recognition, a book under my belt, but something in me, something that had once accepted too much, refused to sit still. I wasn't that woman anymore, the one who watched betrayal unfold in her own home and stayed quiet to preserve a crumbling illusion. This time I would speak, but not to hurt, to protect the part of me that finally knew her worth. I contacted my lawyer, the same one who had once helped me draw boundaries after the separation. I brought every file, every receipt, every email I had ever archived. We reviewed them together methodically. He listened, surprised not at the scale of the deceit but at my composure. I wasn't crying. I wasn't trembling, I was focused, steady. A formal inquiry was opened. Quiet at first, preliminary, discreet. Daniel still had allies, but fewer than before. His shine had dulled. His firm was under new management, and though they tried to distance themselves from him, the damage was already in motion. Weeks passed, investigators called, I gave statements. I handed over everything, not to burn him down, but to lift the weight that had anchored my name to his long after I had walked away. And the more I told, the lighter I became. News began to spread, in whispers then louder. Daniel had stepped back from the firm, internal review, ethics board involvement. Suddenly people remembered that I had once been part of the architecture he stood on, and suddenly they began asking me to speak not just about healing, but about justice. About reclaiming voice in a world that prefers women stay gracious in silence. And Lena, she was gone, or so I thought, until I walked into a cafe one afternoon and saw her across the room. It was like seeing a ghost, but one you no longer feared. Her hair was shorter. She looked tired in a way that wasn't just physical. Her face lit up when she saw me. She stood. I didn't. I watched her approach, the years between us hanging in the air like smoke. She smiled, not wide, but tentative. She looked older, as if the aftermath had aged her faster than time. She didn't say anything, and neither did I, but in that moment something inside me settled. I had imagined revenge so many times. The confrontation, the accusations, the release, but reality was quieter, it always is. I stood not to embrace, but to leave, and as I passed her, I felt nothing but freedom. I didn't need apologies, I didn't need closure, I had become the ending. That night, I sat on my balcony, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea from a chipped cup I had refused to replace. The city hummed beneath me, lights flickering, lives unfolding. I watched the moon climb over the rooftops and thought about the woman I used to be. The one who held her breath in her own kitchen. The one who measured her value by someone else's affection. I thought of her not with pity but with pride, because she had walked into the fire and I had walked out. There was a hearing scheduled, not public, not televised, just a room with lawyers, records, and consequences. I wasn't required to be there, but I went. For myself. For the version of me who had once been erased in a marriage that gave her no credit for her brilliance, no safety for her heart. Daniel sat across from me, jaw tight, tie too perfect. He didn't look like a man defeated. He looked like a man exposed, and in many ways that was worse for him. He avoided my gaze. I didn't flinch. The board read the findings. Breach of fiduciary duty, tampering, misappropriation, nothing that would land him in prison but enough to unravel the legacy he had once built his pride upon. His license would be suspended, his assets under review, his name now a cautionary tale. I didn't smile, I didn't cry. I just stood when it was over and walked out the same way I had walked away from our marriage, calm, clear, and unwilling to carry his shame 1 second longer. Outside, the sky was overcast, soft with coming rain. I pulled my coat tighter and walked, past the courthouse, past the bookstore with my name in the window, past a mural of a phoenix painted on a crumbling wall. I stopped there for a while, watched as the wind picked up loose petals from a tree and tossed them into the air like confetti. And I realized this was not vengeance, this was liberation. That night I lit a candle and placed it in the center of my living room. I sat beside it on the floor, closed my eyes, and whispered a goodbye, not to Daniel, not to Lena, but to the silence. To the years I let myself shrink, to the guilt that was never mine to hold, to the woman who waited too long to rise. And in that space, in the flicker of soft flame and stillness, I felt something shift. Not a beginning, not an end, but a reckoning. And for the first time, I was not afraid of the woman I had become. In the quiet that followed the storm, I discovered something no one had ever taught me. Peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the soft resilience that grows around it, a steady voice that whispers, I am still here, even after everything that tried to erase me. Life didn't suddenly bloom into perfection, but it found rhythm again, a different rhythm, one that pulsed from within me, not around someone else. I kept writing, not just to publish, not for applause, but because I had fallen in love with my own clarity. Words no longer trembled when they left my fingers. They carried weight, conviction. I wrote stories that weren't mine, too, fiction steeped in truth, characters shaped by pieces of me I was finally brave enough to share with the world. The book launched, quietly at first, then with a momentum I never expected. Interviews, emails from strangers, letters from women who had walked their own silent wars. And in the middle of it all I lived, really lived. I adopted a dog, a clumsy golden retriever named Oliver, who had been overlooked in every shelter he'd ever been placed in. He became my shadow, my companion in stillness, my morning alarm. He reminded me with his warm eyes and endless tail wags that loyalty didn't have to be earned through suffering. I moved out of the small apartment, not because I needed more space, but because I wanted to mark the shift in my own narrative. The new place had creaky floorboards and sun-drenched windows. It reminded me of the home I once loved, but without ghosts. I decorated slowly, choosing pieces that made me feel rooted. A handmade quilt from a local market, shelves full of second-hand poetry, a record player that filled the space with Nina Simone on rainy days. And then one morning a package arrived, heavy, wrapped in brown paper with no name but mine. Inside I found a hardcover book, She Who Stayed Standing. The author was a woman I had met once briefly at a conference where we'd spoken in the same panel. Inside the cover she had handwritten, "You gave me permission to write this. Thank you for not disappearing." I held the book to my chest and cried. Not because I was broken, because I was whole. Lucas and I stayed in touch. He never asked for more than I could give, never rushed the quiet, never tried to mold it. We met often, coffee, gallery openings, long walks with Oliver. His presence became a gentle constant, not a rescue, not a replacement, just something real, something kind. One evening in late summer, we walked along the river. The city shimmered behind us, and the air carried that unmistakable scent of something ending and beginning at once. I realized in that moment how far I had come, not geographically, not professionally, but inward. I had come home to myself, a self I didn't know I had the right to reclaim. And yet I did. I began teaching workshops, not just on writing, but on story ownership, on how to rewrite the narratives we've been handed, on how silence is not safety, on how your voice is not a weapon, but a mirror showing the world what they tried to forget about you. Women came in bruised with memory and left stitched with light. We didn't fix each other. We witnessed each other. That was enough. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night, not from nightmares, but from stillness so vast it startled me. I'd sit up, watch Oliver rise with a sleepy yawn, and I'd listen. And what I heard was not loneliness. It was peace. Lena never reached out again. I don't know where she is now. I don't need to. I've let her go not out of forgiveness, but because she no longer occupies the room in my heart she once rented. That space is now filled with things that matter: truth, softness, a red clay mug I made at a pottery class. As for Daniel, I sometimes see his name in legal journals, often attached to phrases like pending appeal or disciplinary review. His story faded into something small, a lesson for others, but he no longer had any gravity in mine. One autumn afternoon, I was invited to speak at a university. The auditorium was filled with students, young women with eyes wide open, and young men trying to understand what it means to stand beside women without eclipsing them. I spoke of betrayal, of recovery, of power not as dominance but as presence. When I finished, a girl approached me, 19, maybe 20. Her hands trembled as she held her phone, asking for a picture. But then she paused and said, "You don't look like someone who was broken." And I smiled. I was never broken, I said silently in my heart. I was silenced. But not anymore. Later that evening, I stood in my kitchen, barefoot, Oliver snoring near the heater. I lit a candle, not for memory, not for mourning, just because I could. The flame flickered gently, casting golden shadows on the walls I had chosen, in a space I had filled, in a life I had built not out of spite, but out of hope. And I thought of the girl I used to be. The wife who doubted her instincts. The sister who trusted too much. The woman who walked away with nothing but a suitcase and a heartbeat. And I whispered to her with gratitude, with awe, we made it. She didn't reply, of course, but I like to believe she smiled. And so I ended not where I began, not with a man or a house or a betrayal, but with a name that now echoed not in pain, but in purpose. My name, Emma, still here, still standing, still rising,